I want to welcome everybody to our today's webinar together with OneIdentity, in which we will talk about making Zero Trust real and what are concrete steps for an effective implementation. My name is Manuela Ollhäuser, Marketing Manager at IC Consult. And before we start with the presentation, just some quick housekeeping notes from my side. You will all be on mute during the webinar, so if you have a question, please type in your question in the chat and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. And we will also record the session, so you will all receive an email with a link to this recording within the next few days. Our presenters today are Rob Bryne, Field Strategist at OneIdentity, Alan Radford, also Field Strategist at OneIdentity, and Andre Priebe, CTO at IC Consult. And please introduce yourself. So I hand over to you, Andre.
Yeah, thank you very much, Manuela, and welcome everybody to our today's session. Yeah, my name is Andre. I'm the CTO of IC Consult, so in charge of our portfolio of vendors we are working together with, like OneIdentity, and also making sure that we are following the right approaches to provide value in the area of digital identity to our customers, especially when it's about security. And that's the reason why we are talking here together now about Zero Trust and how to make it real in your organization. Therefore I'm very excited being here together with Rob and Alan. So Alan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Andre. So my name is Alan Radford. I've been at OneIdentity for 11 years now in the governance and PAM space throughout my career of about 20 years plus. As a field strategist, what we do at OneIdentity is a form of outbound product management. We deal with analyst relations, technical alliances with other vendors, and we maintain strategic relationships with areas of our organization, including support, professional services, sales, pre-sales, marketing, and of course, most importantly, our partners like IC Consult, we're very proud to work with, and also the loudest voice, which is you, the customer. And I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleague, Rob. Over to you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Hi, everyone. I'm a colleague of Alan's, as he said. I also have a field strategy role at OneIdentity. And with respect to what Alan just said, I think what we're hoping to bring here, obviously, is our knowledge of technology, but also some of those key insights we're picking up from customers that could help you as you think about what Zero Trust means for your organization. I will beg your indulgence. There's a bunch of, I'm in the airport, a coachload of retired people are busy planning their trip, so just bear with me. So that's it. So shall we go ahead, Andre? I'll just continue. Yes, thank you. So what we wanted to do was to just set the stage for Zero Trust. You can see we ran a survey, right? So there's nothing like data to inform us. And I'll just kind of talk through some of the key findings of that survey we ran last year. And we asked the question, is Zero Trust important to you? What obstacles or challenges are you having as you deploy it? Have you done it? Is it going to require new technology for you to do that? So just walk through it. The green thing there, the green box, 75%, it's a thing. And I would like to confirm from my experience, and Andre, Alan chime in, a lot of customers I'm speaking to are asking us specifically about Zero Trust. It's a thing for them. And when I say a thing, I mean it's something that the CISOs, the management staff, are asking the IT security teams to rally around and to interpret. But then over the last couple of years, we were asking ourselves, is Zero Trust, is this a buzzword? Is it going to evaporate and so on? I think the answer is no. I think it is a thing, and that's why we continue to engage and think seriously about it. Now, just the bottom two boxes there, a very few number have actually done something with it, 14%. And half of the 50-50 think they may need new technology for it. So what I see is, again, that seems fair to me. Some customers looking at new technology, perhaps modern networking, cloud-based firewall, thinking at the network level. But others very much looking to their current, for example, identity infrastructure and deployments, thinking, what value can we get from that applies to zero trust? And we're going to talk a lot about that today. Now, the one thing I wanted to get to and set the stage for is the challenges, right? So it's the 95% who are saying it's not necessarily obvious to them what to do with it or what it means. And there's three things to call out there. One was that people called out. One was a lack of clarity about what it meant. It's a rather general, what does it really mean? And that's exactly what we're going to be trying to answer in this session here today. The second one was rather generic. They said, well, okay, we might have an idea what we want to do in zero trust, but we got to fight for budget with everybody else. Well, hello, welcome to IT. That's what we do all the time. And the last point was almost the double-edged sword. They called attention to the double-edged sword of the title, Zero Trust. On one hand, it's very punchy, it's very powerful. We can all get behind it, especially in the era of ransomware and all that. But on the other hand, it seems very extreme, right? It seems rather draconian, so very heavy-handed, and that was perceived as a kind of a perhaps not a great message to take to the business. And we'll be discussing later in this session the ways you can soften that message, but still get the value of the impact that zero trust brings, right? So those are some of the thoughts that we had from our customers last year, and as I say, we'll address some of the things that I brought up there. So
there's one thing I want to point out on this slide, Rob, if I may. When we look at these numbers, 75% characterize zero trust as critical, 95% are facing barriers, and 51% plan to implement new technology. So what I take from that is that there's 49% there who are not implementing new technology, but a significant portion of that 49% has still got a zero trust initiative. So there's a lot of organizations out there looking to leverage extra value from what they've got already. And that's something to take away as well.
Definitely. And part of what we're, our approach, I'm sure I see, because what we're doing at One Identity is to try to make it easier to take advantage of some of these zero trust concepts, particularly risk, which is something that Andre is something of an expert on. So he'll be talking about that. And as I put it, as a technology vendor, well, vendor of services as well, but also technology, we're trying to lower what I call the activation energy to gain value, right? Just bring down the complexity so that you can get value. So that's the stage. Andre, I'll invite you to continue, perhaps make comments and continue with the next section.
That's a very exciting finding, I have to say, and I think it's absolutely true. You have to leverage the technology of already there in your organization, and we will learn why in a second, but we should not underestimate it and think in which case it is better to leverage what's already there, in which case it is better to go for a more integrated approach, because from a total cost of ownership perspective, that might make more sense. But before going into these details, let's recap, because I think that's known to most of you. Let's recap the principles of zero trust, how a zero trust architecture look like from a high level perspective, what the challenges are, and then how we can tackle them. What I really like about zero trust is that the core idea is very simple. Yeah? We have three guiding principles. Yeah? Verify explicitly every single request entering the system. Then follow the paradigm of least privilege. Users or accounts should only have the privileges which are really required for them to do their work, to do their business, not more than that. And now the most important one, that's of course the source of the name Zero Trust, assume breach. We have to accept that whatever we do to prevent attacks to our systems will not be successful at the end of the day. Yeah? There will be that breach. That's clear. The question is, what impact does it have? And it's really about minimizing that impact based on that breach. So very simple, three guiding principles. Now, short recap, how does it look like from an architectural perspective to make that idea reality? If we look to the IT infrastructure of the past. Yeah. The situation is we typically try to have a very, very good prevention of attacks by having a strong protection in place to enter the network. But the result of that is typically we have the internet, yeah, and then we have a large zone of implicit trust. That does not mean that we do not do authentication, authorization, that zone of trust. We typically do that, but the barriers in place are much lower than before, yeah? Which results, unfortunately, in the situation that as soon as the attacker is somehow in the network, yeah, it's easy for him to find a path in order to get access to more systems, to get more privileges, and to find at the end of the day the access to very, very critical resources, for ransomware attacks or for stealing the data, for manipulating the data, and so on. So what are we doing with Zero Trust is moving that zones of trust in a different direction, making the untrusted zone as large as possible. So it's not just the internet, it's also internal networks. And the zone of implicit trust as small as possible by having the components in place to protect the resources directly in front of the resource, or as part of it. There are different approaches for different protocols, for different use cases, but authentication authorization is happening right before the resource. That's the core idea. There's a standard architecture by NIST published, explaining how that look like from a conception point of view. I don't want to go through all the components in detail, as most of them are likely known to you. I want to bring the point to attention, which is, of course, a lot of companies leveraging their existing systems because you have to have so many sources of information to make Zero Trust reality that you have to utilize existing landscape. It's not possible doing it without it. The question, and that's somehow a question which we want to answer as part of the session today, is for the very, very crucial components like policy enforcement, policy decision, authentication, authorization, the identity data, including roles, including access privileges for applications, for privileged accounts. Is that something what makes sense to integrate what's already there, or to go for a more unified approach in order to not end up in a nightmare of integration between all the different sources of information, of policies, and so on? Because we're not just talking about the identities and roles, but we are also talking about information of systems. Yeah? So managing the devices, being aware of the compliance status of devices, yeah? Leveraging live informations from outside and inside our organization, and these kind of things. And that's something where it might make sense to follow a more integrated approach. But before we go into these details, I would like to hand over to go a little bit over the Zero Trust tenets before we go on in the details of the systems.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. So it's a very good paper. I would encourage you all to go off and download it. The references at the bottom there, 800-207, and some of the diagrams you've just seen are from that paper. I just want to give a shout out to John Kindervag. Now, for those who don't know, John Kindervag was a VP and principal analyst for Forrester, and during his tenure back in 2010, he was the first to turn around and say that traditional security models operate on the outdated assumption that everything inside an organization's network should be trusted, and then coined the term Zero Trust. That was 13 years ago. It's 13 years ago. This paper was published in 2020. Okay, so it's interesting to see the market catch up to some of these predictions. Now, in terms of the tenets of zero trust, what we've done is we've emboldened some of the things to cherry pick from this for you. The summary here is that you've got lots of resources around data, around people, around technology, around policies, around access, around authentication, and so on. Everything is communicating at all times across your environment, okay? And you're going to have some on-premise, you're going to have some hybrid, because if you've got on-premise and cloud, that's where you are in the hybrid world. I find it very, very interesting when I look at my own role at OneIdentity and a lot of my peers in the industry as well, where our on-premise has stopped being a data center and our on-premise has become endpoint around phones, watches, glasses maybe at some point, our laptops and so on, and even our cars for some of us. And so all of that is being communicated with and transacting data as well, and there's a trust component to that data. Access being on a per session basis and being enforced. Policies are being enforced. The key word there also being dynamic, okay, before access is allowed. And then you're looking at the behavior and the environmental attributes to continually monitor and measure all of this stuff that is in motion. It is a fluidic state, is the takeaway here, okay? It's not the 1990s anymore, okay? It is a fluidic, dynamic world that we are living in. And getting our hands around dealing with that level of complexity, zero trust is a way of thinking that enables us to simplify the challenge in front of us. With that, Andre, if I have the next slide, please. So when you think in those terms, the only way forward really is to consider the identity as being the edge. Now, I would say that it's not necessarily an emerging edge. I think identity has been the new perimeter for some time now. But I think what is true to say here is that our understanding of it being the edge is emerging. A lot of customers coming to us with zero trust initiatives, moving from an infrastructure-centric to an identity-centric approach to security. A lot of cloud initiatives are actually forcing customers to think in these terms, because we had the luxury in the data center of just having physical security, of having firewalls. About if we have something as simple as a password vault and we put it into a piece of hardware, then somebody can't just put it on a USB stick and take it home. They have to unrack something, physically take it to their car. That is no longer the world we live in. We have to look in terms of an identity-centric approach to security, particularly at scale. One of the examples that I use when talking to customers and even some of my friends at home when they say, hey, Alan, what do you do for a living? One of the examples that helped resonate with me on the zero trust topic is when we think of ourselves and when we think about the accounts that we have. You know, I sat down once and I said to myself, I'm going to count the number of accounts that I have. And I started with Facebook, Twitter, email, Netflix, Amazon, etc. and so on. There was a virtual machine that I downloaded from the Oracle website a couple of years ago. I had to create an account for it. I started dieting. I downloaded an app to do dieting. It said it was free for the first 7 days and then wanted £50 a month. So I cancelled it. But I created an account for it, okay? 65, and I stopped counting. If you go away and count the number of accounts you've got and ask yourself, do I have a challenge? That's the challenge that enterprises are facing here when we look at the quanta of the identity, the individual, you. Next slide, please. So when we look at a zero trust architecture, and if we could step through and animate this in, there are a number of different building blocks that are in of themselves low-hanging fruit for us to actually start a foundation for a zero trust initiative. And when we look in terms of networks, platforms, and applications, as I've just mentioned, there are a number of other moving parts that would fit in those areas. The applications themselves, a lot of them are running in the cloud, on the platform side, the network side, and so on. These building blocks are things that can help you form a foundation. Securing Active Directory as your Active Directory is like common sense to a lot of us. A lot of us are already taking steps to do that because it's a centralized point for authentication and in some cases authorization. But I ask you, do you want to have Active Directory? The number of times I've stood up in a room and I've asked for a show of hands, who's got Active Directory? Everybody's hands go up. And then you ask, do you want Active Directory? Everybody's hands go down. And the number of CISOs who I've spoken to who would use phrases like, I cannot wait to burn it to the ground and never see it again. You know, it's one of those things where it's so deeply ingrained in our organization, we can't move away from it despite how hard we try. And the average, I would say the average from my own conversations with our customers and partners alike in the field about how hard it is for organizations to move away from Active Directory, the average estimate is about 4 years, based on the amount of actual effort that's been put in and how it's grown legs and it's become its own thing, you know. And so many organizations going down the path of saying to themselves, well, I don't know what this account does. I'm going to have to disable it to see what breaks. That's not a sensible approach, is it? To some it is. To some, they've got no choice. And so when you look at how you go about securing AD, it's not as simple as buying a tool. There's a strategy in that in of itself. And that underpins a great deal many other things, like the single sign-on and MFA. You know, if you're not authenticating from Active Directory, where are you authenticating from? Are you going to be using a cloud directory? Are you going to be using your own directory? Are you going to be using a proprietary directory? Are you going to be using multiple directories? And then, of course, when we layer on privileged access with the administrators, if you've got all of these directories being managed, who's managing the directories? Who's creating the accounts? Who's assigning the privileges? And how you manage that is very, very instrumental to zero trust, because the old adage of a user using a system and a privileged user changing system has gone away. There's now much more privileges being assigned to business users as well, some of those privileges of an administrative nature. And that is something that doesn't just require the never trust, always verify mantra, but it also requires continuous visibility as to where that trust slider is being moved. Identity governance administration allows the business themselves to drive that slider. This is correct. The business says so. This is not correct. The business says so. And without that governance aspect of the business feeding into that dynamic, ongoing, fluidic nature of the policies themselves, it's very, very easy to find yourself back at square one in Active Directory, where it just grew its own legs, and then we start to panic in 5 to 10 years' time. Log management being the final piece there, where when we saw the diagram earlier from the NIST paper, that log management underpins being able to have that visibility of not just where the policies are centralized and where the policies are being enforced, but also elsewhere in the environment where the knock-on effects of this access are being realized, where the access is in fact in of itself being used. And those areas, okay, those 5 areas that you see there on the screen, those fundamental building blocks, when you look at any one of them in isolation, can be a place to start for you. And when you put those building blocks together in a unified fashion, it enables you to have a very, very mature security posture indeed. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about privileged account management, also known as privileged access management. And if we can animate out the slide, it very much deals with who is accessing what and how. Traditional privileged access management standards revolve around managing the account in terms of the credential. If Rob wants to check out a credential, then he would request it. He would get the credential. When that request expires, the password is reset, therefore Rob doesn't know what it is anymore. Or Andre might log into a system with a session. And by using a session in combination with password rotation, Andre can have a recorded session, so the business could record that session and could even apply some controls to that session. Hey, look, Andre, you've not run this command ever. And if you run this command, you're going to delete a database table. So I'm going to block that command on this occasion and conduct a review. Aside from that, when combined with the password management, Andre doesn't actually need to know what the password is at all. So there are methods there to implement passwordless when you combine that with broader access management approaches that Rob will speak about in a moment. But one key point I want to highlight here, and I'm going to point at 2 things. One's the Coca-Cola logo you see there. There was a recent Gartner survey where 98% of respondents said that they have assigned they have assigned administrative privileges to non-administrative business users at some point over the last year. Okay, so let that sink in for a moment. Okay, ask yourselves, in my organization, have I been assigning privileged access, which historically we would call administrative access? Am I assigning those sort of high-level privileges to business users who are not IT admins? Okay, now there's going to be one of three answers to that. No, in which case you've already got a very secure, very mature security posture. Congratulations. The answer is yes, in which case there's work to do. Or the answer is I don't know, in which case ask internally, ask the questions. With the Coca-Cola example, you know, that Facebook logo, to highlight the point, one organization I worked with in particular, who I shan't name here, have a very, very, very powerful brand. And it is a very valuable brand. Now, if they say the wrong thing, they have a team. They have a team of people, around 6 people, whose job in life is counter social media. Not promoting the company, countering bad press. That's their job in life. 6 people doing nothing but that. Now, they don't have administrative access to the Facebook database. They use Facebook as users. They are all privileged users as far as that organization is concerned, because of the risk they carry. If they say the wrong thing to the wrong people on social media, the share price goes down significantly. There is a loss of revenue directly attached to the activity those people are doing. As far as that company is concerned, that's privileged access. And those are the terms in which we have to think about today. I would also point out the robot on the screen there. And as my colleagues will tell you, this is a topic that I feel very passionately about indeed, because they are the emerging identity whose perimeter we are not observing. Okay, how many records in your HR database were literally born yesterday? Would you care? And if those records that were born yesterday in HR have been provisioned to privileged systems, would you care? If they've been provisioned to payroll and they have sort codes and account numbers, would you care? The proliferation of robots coming from line of business rather than IT or security teams is so prolific. There are organizations in the finance sector out there who have over 9,000 bots in production, unmanaged, because they don't know where they are. Because if they're born in, if a non-human resource is born in human resources, how do you manage that? Okay, if you take a role in your business and rather than employing a person to do that role, you virtualize that role with an AI, how are you managing that? How are you monitoring that? The same controls apply, but the approach is different. When we look through the lens of zero trust, how we look at the life cycle of a virtual identity is at least as important as the life cycle of a physical identity like the 3 of us you see here today. Rob, do you have any comments on that?
Stop! You're scaring me. You know, you know. I mean, all of those emerging areas requiring, you know, all of the usual, you know, authentication, authorization, governance aspects. But with, yes, they walk like ducks, they talk like this, but they kind of fly a bit different, right? The dynamics are a bit different. The time frames are, the scale is significantly different, and these are all the modern topics in, you know, that come around identity, where identity can bring value. I didn't want to interrupt you, Phil, but with respect to directories, I have started to think about Active Directory pretty much like mainframes. Honestly, it's going to be, this is my opinion, it's going to be still deployed at scale with great complexity, with significant, you know, need for management and governance. Until I certainly retire with my gray hairs or whatever, you know. I think it's there for the duration. And what we've seen in the evolution of directory is not so much a replacement of that as a kind of an extension of it to the cloud, right? Because we used to debate with the people in directory, which is where I came from originally, as it were. Was, hey, what's going to replace LDAP? It's going to be some amazing cloud thing. What protocol will it be? We're going to XMLize. There was still XML heavy, you know, those days. And of course, we see that there is no one. There never is, right? One magic cloud, one magic protocol, one magic directory. We end up with, you know, multi-directory, multi-repository, you know, hybrid multi-cloud world. And I think there's some of the the themes around directory is a thing, right? Yes, we've got cloud directories now, but we still keep those traditional directories as well. And then of course with Active Directory, you're seeing things like what you call on-premise Active Directory actually running in the cloud in a VM, right? So it's like, it's kind of on-prem. Well, no, it's not. It's just traditional Active Directory. So a lot of really interesting topics there. But yeah, no, privilege clearly. Andre will get to this in his risk session. It's clearly a place where attention goes with risk. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway there is that, like, if you want to move away from Active Directory, where are you going to go? You know, because to your point, Rob, like, where are you going to go?
Yeah. Exactly.
There's one very exciting topic. So I really like the Coca-Cola example as a business user because it's absolutely obvious that they have a very, very strong impact to the business, and therefore these accounts are critical. Also exciting is the DevOps example, because that's where we see a lot of our clients somehow struggling, because what is the point at DevOps? It's first of all bringing together the developers and the operators, but at the same time changing completely the way how they operate by automation, by having all the privileged access scripted, automated, and of course they would like doing all the credentials, passwords into the code repository, to have infrastructure as code, configuration as code, these modern paradigms. But that's, of course, a very huge risk having credentials in the repositories. Therefore, privileged account management is also taking care of managing credentials. So it's a very, very important aspect for every company which is following the DevOps paradigm.
Well, it's like you say, Andre, you know, when engaging with customers on the DevOps topic, there's a great deal of complexity when you go from one customer to another, because no DevOps tool chain is the same. But then when you start going infrastructure as code, you start moving away from a traditional account-based model, and you start moving into the world of PKI certificates and API keys. And then the question becomes, how do I track the creation and what those keys are actually used for? And that line gets blurred as well. Privileged access management has ways of adding value to that. But to your point, customers are facing real challenges around all of this crypto agility that I've created for myself. How do I actually get visibility and manage that?
Absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, let me continue then with so Alan has introduced the where identity figures in that kind of IT kind of architecture. He's introduced the notion of privilege and some of the problems that we're looking at there. I'm just going to continue on that broad identity topics with access management, but what I wanted to do, and I'm going to kind of assume that people know what access management is: single sign-on, right? Federation, multi-factor authentication. These are, you know, things we know. I think we should be quite familiar with already, and certainly multi-factor, particularly multi-factor authentication. You know, your phone, you know, tokens, you know, a variety of those things. Chosen perhaps according to, as Zero Trust asks us to do, according to the context, the security context where the user or the thing is trying to access. Those are things that I think we should all be familiar with already. And I wanted on this topic to really just take a moment to call attention to some of the newer stuff, right? That we're kind of scratching. I'll be honest, we're scratching our heads, we're thinking about this, and I just wanted to kick around and share some of the initial thoughts we have on this. So what we have on the screen there is, on the left-hand side there, you can see some screenshots of an iPhone. And what you're looking at is one of these wallets that contain signed, you know, verified credentials about, for example, me or this user in this case. It's obviously a demo system I've got there. So you can see on the left is I've actually got a bunch of different signed assertions about me. And then I've opened up one of those, and you can see it's all green, right? So that means it's still in scope. I mean, it's still active. It hasn't expired, and it's just basically assertions about my identity. But I've got it. The key thing here is I have it, and it's on my phone. Okay, even if it's been issued by somebody else. Now, the somebody else, you might be thinking, who are these issuers? And you can see on the right-hand side, I kind of sketched, the idea of the issuer. The issuer is the person that issues these. Could be government agency, right? Could be the driving license people. This guy has a driving license. This person has a degree. This person is a medical consultant. This person is a qualified, I don't know, like lifesaver, canoe, instructor, whatever it is. All kinds of organizations can sign these things. I can carry this with me. And the key point for me at this point around decentralized identity is that we're delegating control. We're delegating control to the person, to users, because we choose when we release that information to some service that's requesting it, right? And what I find interesting in the context of zero trust here is a lot of this stuff, this technology also comes with the promise of passwordless, right? And passwordless doesn't mean we're not going to check and validate, right? So it's not against zero trust, but it's trying to make zero trust more real, more acceptable, right? Because we know that people forget, as Alan's pointing, all those accounts, they've all probably got different passwords, we forget them. What if we go passwordless and delegate that trust in an appropriate way to the users themselves? And I would also remind you that that very much feeds into the more ethical side of security these days around consent and privacy and giving me control of it. And that idea that I can delegate control, and I need a certain amount of trust to do that, right? And you can see in the picture, there's a kind of an implicit trust there indicated. I trust the user to manage these verified credentials himself. I want to give it to him in the interest of agility, but with the appropriate security around it, and the appropriate trust framework around it, we can do well. And so what I really wanted to say was, like, zero trust doesn't mean that we're locking everything down and we're totally centralizing everything and locking things. No, we can still gain agility. We can delegate trust to users, to other organizations, as long as we do it in a secure way. And then the final point I wanted to make here was that whilst if you listen to some of the people talk about this stuff, it all sounds rather like magic. Some issuer gives me a wallet, I put it on my phone, and off I go, right? I'm happy into the wild. The reality is that that dotted line there between those two green circles is mediated by an infrastructure, right? A backing infrastructure. So just to try and give you some examples of use cases here, which will feed into the next slide, is think about the consumer identity access management, right? So yes, perhaps Andre's got something on his phone. He works for IC Consult. They're a partner of One Identity. They come to One Identity. Andre comes to One Identity to access some of our partner stuff. Well, okay, great. We trust IC Consult. They've signed your verified credentials, but it's still up to us as One Identity to decide what we're going to give Andre access to. Okay, and in other words, we need governance right at that point, right? So the fact that we have these almost magical decentralized identities, so on, it doesn't remove the fact that we need that backing governance and so on, right? Because when you talk about governance, it's all well and good to talk about provisioning things and getting things set up and agility. The thing you really need to always remind yourself is, how do I remove the access, right? And am I going to revoke these decentralized identities, right? And those revocation actions in response to identity. Andre leaves IC Consult. Are we going to let him continue to walk around with these? No, we're not. We have to have a central place where we're going to revoke that. And then when Andre tries to present that from his phone, that's the moment we'll discover, hey, you don't work for IC Consult anymore, and therefore we're going to remove the access that we granted you. So you can see that decentralized identity brings us a lot. It brings us agility and control in the hands of the user, but it doesn't. The point I want to make is it doesn't remove our obligations to have good governance and infrastructure behind it, right, to support that. So with having mentioned governance, right, and the identity access management use case, if you just go ahead, Andre, and fall on to the next slide, right, which is around identity governance, right. So the identity governance topic, again, this is another major area of identity, as you know, and the reason that one of the things I wanted to call out here is that whilst identity governance has traditionally been a back office sort of activity, generating reports, doing access reviews, not really an enforcement point at all. And so therefore you might think, well, governance is good, but is it really like in the front line of zero trust? And I would argue that yes, it is very much in the front line of zero trust, because governance is a place where you go for policy definitions. As Andre showed in his picture earlier, there's got policy definition and enforcement points. And zero trust calls on us, or at least forces us to think about policies like just-in-time access, okay? And if we don't go as far as just-in-time access, just enough access, okay? Just enough privilege, just sufficient permissions, right, for me to do my job. And that was Andre's point, to do with least privilege, right? And getting to a least privilege place is always something you can only do with identity governance. The other thing I want to say about governance in the modern world, with respect to some of those themes that Alan was bringing up, is there are a lot of facets to governance. There's traditional identities and entitlements you can see there. But think about all the privilege world that Alan's talking about, right? There's all that privilege stuff going on, and these privileged things have got access. How do they get that access? Is it something that we give them respected just in time, like all the time? Is it something we activate when they need it, right? And that's a governance question, right? Yes, so for example, cloud platforms have their own way to manage privilege to some extent, right? So in Azure, of course, you've got Azure PIM, which allows administrators to elevate. But then the question is, hey, who are the Azure accounts, right, that are allowed to elevate? And how do they get that ability to elevate? And shouldn't I keep an eye on that? And government, yes, you should. And so you still have a governance question, even if you have that, cloud native capability security in place. Okay? And that's kind of what I'm hinting at there with the cloud governance piece, right? Managing infrastructure. Application governance, I'm going to call out, touches a bit on access management, because if you think about access management, what's really doing is giving you single sign-on federation capabilities for your applications. But from a governance point of view, one of the big challenges here, which it's true goes more towards agility than security, but nevertheless, I think it's an important theme, is the onboarding of applications into these environments. And one of the themes we're exploring is how can we delegate control, and again, in a trusted way, right, in a well-trusted way, to application owners, right, so that we, as the identity people, can, yes, let's be honest, offload some work to them. In other words, we give them the right place where they can publish entitlements around their applications and so on. If you go ahead and move on, I just want to, well, we all wanted to kind of bring this all together for you. We've talked about different identity-based capabilities. And when they all come together, and you've got governance, you've got privilege, and you're protecting those directories, they're so important for, well, the foundation of the whole infrastructure. They come together, and you can build it out, Andre, the whole thing. They come together with different capabilities and so on. And the key message here is, as you put these capabilities in place, they need to talk to each other, right? They need to share information, and they need to share identity data, correlation data, all these accounts. Who do they link to? Who owns them and who governs them? These robot identities. Who is the person who's responsible for these things? There must be somebody, right? If there isn't, then we're in trouble, and that's kind of what Alan was hinting at. Now, don't panic, right? If you don't have all of these capabilities, or don't panic if they're currently not, talking to each other the way that perhaps you would like, or that this architecture suggests. But you should go in the right direction. But one of the things that we're doing at One Identity is to try, as I say, lower the activation energy around these features and capabilities. And one of the key things that we want to do as we bring all of this together, I'll just lead into the next section, is around the topic of risk, right? Because one of the things that we can measure here to drive our policy and drive what we're doing is risk. So Andre, I know you've got some things to say about risk, which are quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we see here, obviously, and learned before, there's so many things we can do to bring more security into our enterprise, to our organization. But often the question is where to start, because you cannot do everything at once, right? And what we have really seen that it can help a lot to think about the business risk we have based on the different potential vulnerabilities, potential incidents out there, and try to categorize them a little bit based on an identity risk management. For instance, think about a compromised B2B accounts. Yeah, an account of one of your business partners is compromised. How likely is that to happen? Yeah, so here we see on the x-axis the likelihood of such events. And I think we can all agree this is somehow likely that one account of a B2B partner will be compromised. Yeah, that's just partially under your control. And then the question is, how strong is the impact to your organization that compromised accounts is causing? And okay, of course, that depends on your particular business case, but anyhow, it might be moderate. Yeah, and then we can think about the mitigations we have as a capability based on the unified platform we learned about. Yeah, and what we can try to apply is the toolbox zero trust there. For instance, introducing multi-factor authentication, very obvious step. So how much does that help? Well, at least it will somehow decrease the likelihood that this account will be compromised. Yeah, that's obvious. Will it make it unlikely or rare? I don't know. Of course, it depends a little bit on which kind of multi-factor authentication I'm able to apply. We learned about a couple of MFA attacks the last years, for instance, MFA bombing, MFA fatigue. But anyhow, we all agree that the risk is decreased. Do we decrease the impact based on MFA? Likely not. But now the governance we have learned before comes somehow into place, because that helps us to implement least privilege. Even for B2B user, it is worth thinking about what privilege does that account should have in your organization based on the role he has in the foreign organization. Yeah. So applying least privilege not just to privileged accounts, but also to standard accounts. This will reduce the impact. What can happen if that account is compromised, and therefore reducing the overall risk. We are looking into to standard users, but also we have to take care about the privileged accounts. Typically, that the privileged accounts compromised isn't that likely, but possible. The impact, of course, is much higher. We learned about the Active Directory. Nobody likes anymore, but of course nearly everybody has. If a domain administrator is compromised, then you can imagine how strong the impact is to your organization. So we have to take care of it. For instance, by making sure that we have a credential management for the privileged accounts in place, but that might not be enough. We might have to do more. For instance, introducing privileged session management, or going for a kind of just-in-time non-standing privileges, so that that these accounts do not exist at all at the target system, but really provisioned with the right set of privileges in the time they are required. And by that, we can then really move into the green area of the risk management by having the different mitigations in place. There is not that one tool which is mitigating all of these kind of risks, but based on a platform approach, the different components are there which can play together hand in hand and generate a lot of value based on that. So if you look a little bit into the one identity landscape here, we see that we have to bring together the capabilities for MFA based on OneLogin, applying the pattern of least privilege with Identity Manager, and then taking care of the privileged accounts based on safeguards that have a lot of not overlap, but interconnecting with each other, handing over the responsibility for the mitigating activities to each other. And that helps me to get an understanding where to start, where I can bring the most value based on reduced risk for my organization. Yeah, based on that, we can now talk a little bit about the balancing of security, of agility, and which rules to apply and which not.
Andre, thanks for that. Risk. I think we could do a whole topic on risk itself. I would just say I'm a big advocate of just measuring things, right? So when you talk about risk, another advantage of the platform approach is just measuring. Where are those dormant accounts? Where are those unused entitlements? Where are those outliers that have excessive, permissions? Perhaps some of them privileged ones, like the examples that Alan was mentioning, right? And just measuring it and seeing the dashboard, And by the way, I know this is not the topic of how to succeed your program, but once you measure it, 3 months later, you can come back and you can show that you're going in the right direction, right? But with respect to this topic, the security agility balance and rolling out the zero trust in an organization, the thing that strikes me is the kind of the cartoon is trying to say that there are exceptions. There'll always be exceptions, and if as security professionals, as IT guys, we don't allow for the exceptions and integrate that into our workflows, we're going to fail, right? We'll end up like the unfortunate chap there, right? Trying to follow rules that don't really make sense and they'll just never fly. The security agility balance, I want to give you some concrete examples. So again, just to pick from the governance world, if you do measure outliers, excessive entitlements, dormant accounts, native changes and so on, and you want to get rid of them, and you want to remove those and prune them, we have to, one of the things we're seeing as we roll out those type of programs in the context of zero trust, and this is feedback from customers, is you got to educate managers. It's okay to be the bad guy. It's okay to take things away, because if this person really needs that access, right, we're going to make it very easy for them to get it back, right? So get an email telling them they've lost something. If they really click here, right, you know what? We'll even soften it further, because normally we need, I don't know if you can see my finger, normally we need 2 approvals. But in the context where you've just lost it, perhaps following an access review, we're going to ease off on one of those and we'll just let you away with it, right? So things we can give, it's give and take, right? That's the kind of seesaw. I see it as a give and take. And hey, this decentralized identity thing we're saying as well, you know what? We're gonna give you control. You're gonna have a wallet, and we're gonna let you go off and do things with it, right? But on the other hand, perhaps you need to accept certain policies on your phone, or we're going to roll out MFA, biometrics. So you're going to, it's going to be a give and take there with the business, right? So that's one of the I think observations there. So there's some hints on that. The other thing in the context of rolling out zero trust, and this is something I wanted to share, which again an insight from a customer, which is, we've seen in the pictures, I think everybody's seen those architecture pictures, it's a transverse topic. it touches a lot of different layers in the security stack. And when we see different layers as technologists, we should be old and wise enough at this point to realize behind every technology, there's a team. And with every team, there's a manager, and they might be in different organizations and so on, right? So it's a transverse thing. And what some customers have done is to set up cross-functional working groups around the topic of zero. So they meet, once a month or once every 6 weeks, and they'll talk about what it means for them in their world, right? And some, not all of them, but some of them, even the more innovative ones, are starting to try to join those dots in the way that we've been talking about, with a kind of an integrated, identity as a platform sort of approach. And they're seeing some great value with that. And that's a very, in terms of closing out gaps and blind spots and risk areas, right? Because too often a lot of these, our teams, despite good intentions, tend to work in silos, right? So that's one thing to share there. Andre, unless you guys have some comments, please go ahead.
I'd comment, if I may, just briefly on that seesaw. It's important to recognize that when you're investing in security and you're doing it strategically, you are releasing revenue through agility. And I'd give some direct examples like that. It's easy to sit here and say, oh yeah, operational efficiency. But if you consider that if you're implementing these tools in the correct way, the way in which you saw Andre articulate the movement of the risk posture for those individual items, well, consider, if you will, that if you're automating some of that stuff in the right way, then you're reducing the time to onboard. You're reducing the number of tickets generated. You are releasing unused licenses. There's lots and lots of revenue being released by the investment in security, and that's without even mentioning cybersecurity insurance premiums. So it's important to recognize this seesaw is deliberately tilted, okay? Because the more you invest in security strategically, the more agile you become and the more revenue you release as a result. That's it, that's all I got, sorry.
Yeah, but that's a very good point. Yeah, you can make the system more secure and more agile and more user-friendly at the same time. That's the message. It's not. It doesn't have to move into opposite directions. Yeah.
I think we can all contribute to this kind of wrap-up slide. But basically, what I want to say here is that whatever your identity sort of capabilities are at the moment, identity as a thing, right, as something that you can harden, as something that you can aggregate policy around, is something that will allow you to hit all those zero trust tenets, most of them, right, the ones that are relevant to do with dynamic policy, to do with bringing context into security decisions. If I challenge you with this question, what is the role of identity in cybersecurity, right, in zero trust? What is its role? And we've talked about a lot of things, right? It's kind of hard to come up with one thing, but Alan actually touched on it earlier. For me, if I had to sum it up and say one sentence, it would be that it brings business context into our IT security decisions, right? It forms that bridge or that central, whichever way you want to imagine it. And that's why it's so interesting and also sometimes challenging, right? Because we're dealing with human aspects of security as well as those technical, and identity really is that bridge. And by making use of as much identity capabilities as we can, having them talk to each other, having them share risk, having them share information and measurements about the environment, we can bring adaptive into the zero trust story, and adaptive is key to succeeding, right? I think that's what I would like to say about that.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. So, and also to our participants for following the discussion here together with Robert and Alan. So I hope there was some valuable information for you and some things you can take with you to make your organizations more secure. So Robert, Alan, thank you very much for having these discussions today here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. Thanks, Manuela. Very, very interesting.